She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stood still, one hand gently resting on the shoulder of a man most people try to ignore, and the other holding a leash that led to a calm black lab in a red vest. And in that moment, right in the middle of Sunday morning service at New Eden Church, Joanna Ellis was fired. Not for breaking the law. Not for disrespecting anyone. But for showing respect where others refused to. This is a place of worship, not a shelter, the Reverend had said. But the look in Joanna's eyes said something else entirely. Worship without compassion is just noise. She didn't cry. She just removed her church badge, tucked it into her sweater pocket, and walked out, with the veteran by her side. What she didn't know was that someone had filmed the whole thing. And before the end of the day, that little clip, 37 seconds long, would set off a ripple that reached far beyond the church walls, all the way to veterans groups, community halls, and even the governor's office. This isn't the story of a protest. It's not loud. No marches, no signs, no shouting. It's the story of a quiet woman, a broken soldier, and a town that had to decide, do we follow rules, or do we follow what's right? If you've ever watched someone do the right thing and pay the price for it. If you've ever sat in silence when you knew you should have stood. Then this story is for you. Because sometimes, courage doesn't show up in uniforms or parades. Sometimes, it walks into a library. Holding a leash. Hoping someone will just let him sit down without making him feel like a burden. So stay with us. Because what happened next in Lexington, Alabama, might just restore a piece of your faith in people. And if not, it might challenge you to become the one who restores it for someone else. The sidewalk in front of New Eden Church was only wide enough for one person at a time. The bricks were uneven, pressed into the dirt long before the town got around to pouring concrete anywhere else. Joanna Ellis walked it often, always taking the same slow steps past the rose bushes someone's grandmother had planted decades ago. But today, she didn't pause at the flower bed. She just kept walking, hands still faintly shaking, her keys pressing cold against her palm. Across the street, the town of Lexington moved like it always did on a Sunday, quietly, deliberately. The bakery's open sign flickered behind a foggy window. A man in a blue Ford idled at the corner, waiting for the light that never really changed. And just beyond the post office, tucked between the pharmacy and the barber shop, stood the library. It wasn't much to look at. A low, square building with faded siding and a door that creaked no matter how much oil you used. The front window was taped from where a storm last winter cracked the glass. But inside, the floors were solid, the chairs mismatched but clean, and the walls held more peace than most sanctuaries could promise. This was where Joanna came when the sermons felt too sharp. This was where she sorted donations, ran story hour, and brewed coffee from a machine with a chipped handle. Luther Jennings didn't say a word as they approached. He held the leash gently, his thumb rubbing the stitched edge of the leather loop like it steadied something in him. His boots were military issue, but worn soft at the toe. Benny walked without pulling, without sniffing. Just close. Always close. When they stepped through the door, the air changed. Not louder. Not colder. Just still. Joanna switched on the lamp by the front desk, its shade slightly tilted from the last time the kids got too excited. She didn't rush to speak. She moved to the back counter, opened the small fridge, and pulled out a carton of milk. Her movements were quiet. Familiar. She knew this space. She trusted it to hold things the church never could. Luther stood in the center of the room, one hand resting lightly on the back of a reading chair. He didn't sit. He scanned the shelves without focusing, as if reading the titles would demand something he didn't want to give. Joanna poured 2 cups. Black for her. A little milk for him. She didn't ask, but she remembered from the last time he stopped by, when he'd only stayed long enough to return a book no one else had checked out. She placed the mug on the table near the window. Not too close to the edge. Not far enough to look like an invitation. Then she sat down in the chair across from it and waited, not for a conversation, not for thanks. Just to be there, in case being there was enough. Luther didn't move for a while. His fingers hovered just above the chair, then pulled back. Then he sat beside him, tail tucked in, eyes steady. And finally, Luther took the seat. Joanna didn't smile. She just nodded once, slow. A gesture that said, "This place is yours too." Even if no one else says it out loud. Even if they pretend not to see you. I do. And the library, for the first time that day, felt full. Next morning, the library opened quietly. There was no official announcement, no ribbon, no sermon. Just a wooden door with a handwritten note taped beside the handle, "Reading room open." All welcome. The kind of welcome that didn't need exclamation points. Joanna arrived early, as she always did. She didn't wear anything special, just her gray sweater, pressed slacks, and the pendant her husband had given her on their 10th anniversary. She unlocked the door, turned on the old floor fan, and began setting out chairs. She laid out a tray with paper cups and a half-empty tin of instant coffee. Nothing fancy. But the gesture was warm. By 8:30, the first regulars had come in. Mrs. Vaughn from the florist's shop brought a stack of puzzles. Mr. Keene from the hardware store returned his copy of The Things They Carried. Camila came too, wearing earbuds and carrying 2 scones in a paper bag. She nodded at Joanna and took her usual corner by the poetry shelf. And just before 9, Luther stepped inside. He didn't make a sound. His shoulders filled the doorframe, not because he was tall, but because he carried something invisible that seemed to stretch around him. Benny padded in quietly beside him, tail low, vest clean. Luther held a book under one arm. The cover had frayed corners, and the pages looked like they'd been turned with care, not speed. No one spoke when he entered. They didn't have to. They just watched. Not with warmth. Not with hostility. Just that middle kind of silence, the kind that sizes people up without saying so. Luther paused by the second row of chairs, then nodded once and sat down. Benny curled at his feet without instruction. Joanna met his eyes. She didn't smile. Just placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table beside him and moved back to the desk. It took only a minute before it began. A woman near the window shifted in her seat, crossed her arms, then turned slightly so her back faced him. Someone coughed twice and didn't cover their mouth. Another man lowered his voice as he spoke to his friend, but not enough to hide the words, "Thought this place had rules. Guess not anymore." Joanna heard it all. She didn't interrupt. Didn't raise her voice. But her hands, which had just placed a new stack of newspapers by the shelf, lingered a moment too long. Her fingers pressed into the pages. Then released. Luther didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the page in front of him. But once, just once, his hand moved to Benny's back, resting there. Not stroking. Just holding. And Benny didn't move. The room settled. The clock ticked louder than before. Outside, the breeze picked up, brushing the corners of the taped-up window. A child's laugh echoed faintly from down the block. No one said what they were thinking. That's how it often went. But in that room, lined with quiet books and folding chairs, the divide didn't need to be named. It was already there. Just like it had always been. Waiting. Watching. Measuring who would speak first. And who would choose, instead, to stay. The call came just after noon. Joanna had just finished wiping down the reading tables when the library phone rang. It didn't ring often. Mostly just the school or a neighbor asking about overdue returns. But this call was clipped, formal. Reverend Trenton's voice on the other end. No greeting. Just a flat line of words strung together like fence posts. The church board has decided to place you on immediate suspension, he said. Pending a review of your conduct in light of recent concerns raised by several members. Joanna didn't ask which members. She didn't ask what conduct. She simply said, I understand, then hung up the phone. The cord recoiled slowly as she stepped back. Her shoulders didn't rise. Her eyes didn't blink faster. She just stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the back of the nearest chair. Outside, the wind had picked up. A sheet of loose newspaper tumbled across the sidewalk, caught briefly on the corner of the steps before sliding under the door. Luther had heard. He didn't ask for details. He didn't offer comfort. He just stood beside the front shelf, one hand tucked into his jacket, his other hand resting on Benny's head like it had always belonged there. By 2 o'clock, the news had trickled into town. Not loudly. Not from the pulpit. But through quieter channels, the flower shop's backroom, the hair salon's waiting bench, the diner booth where retired men passed the same stories over coffee every morning. Some folks didn't say anything at all. Just shifted in their seats, glanced up from their newspapers, and went back to stirring cream into their cups a little longer than needed. Others asked questions that weren't really questions. Don't we have policies for a reason? Maybe it's not about him. Maybe it's just about protocol. But the tone changed when the video surfaced. Camila had posted it without fanfare. Just a 38-second clip. No commentary. Just Joanna, standing between a man and a door that was about to close on him. Her voice steady. Her hands still. By sundown, the video had been shared to 4 community pages, passed through 3 veteran groups, and sent by text to people who hadn't set foot in a church in years. Joanna didn't check her phone that night. She sat by the window of the library, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap. Benny lay nearby, breathing slow. Luther read quietly, one line at a time, as though each word had to be earned. No one knocked on the door. But somewhere in the quiet of that room, the ground had already shifted. Not loudly. Not fast. But deeply. And in towns like Lexington, Alabama, that was where change always began. In the rooms people didn't look twice at. With the people no one expected to stand still when it mattered. By the time the sun touched the rooftops, the library had emptied. Camila lingered a little longer than usual, quietly stacking books, her phone resting face up on the edge of the desk. Joanna stood by the front window, arms crossed loosely, watching the street like something might arrive without warning. Luther hadn't spoken since the call from the church. He stayed seated near the nonfiction shelf, Benny curled at his feet, their stillness making the room feel like it had been carved out of the air itself. Camila checked her phone again. Then again. Finally, she turned the volume all the way down and pressed post. No caption. No edits. Just the clip. Joanna standing between a man and a voice that had told him he didn't belong. Her hands calm. Her body still. 38 seconds of quiet defiance, caught by instinct, not intention. The first view came within a minute. Then a dozen. Then 100. Then more. By the time Joanna walked back to the desk, Camila didn't say anything. She just nodded once and left the phone unlocked, screen blowing softly in the low light. Outside, the wind lifted a strand of Joanna's hair as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She tucked it behind her ear without thinking, her fingers lingering a little too long near her temple. At the hardware store, someone tilted a phone toward a neighbor and said, "Is that the church lady?" At the VFW hall, a former Army medic hit play, then sat back in his chair and didn't speak for 3 whole minutes. In a town 25 miles east, a retired Marine forwarded the clip to his daughter, with the message, "She stood for him. Like someone should have stood for me." By midnight, the comments began to reach the library's inbox. One from Oregon. One from Savannah. One from a woman who simply wrote, "My husband wore the same vest. They asked him to leave a grocery store. I hope she knows she's not alone." Joanna didn't reply. She read them quietly, one hand resting near the keyboard but never moving to type. She scrolled slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in strain, but in something closer to searching. Luther remained at the same table. He hadn't touched the book in front of him. He just watched the space between them, his fingers gently circling the stitched seam of Benny's leash. Somewhere around 2 a.m., the library's old radiator kicked back on. It clanked once, like it always did when the temperature dipped too low too fast. Joanna rose, crossed the room, and placed an extra blanket over the chair next to Luther's. She didn't say goodnight. He didn't say thank you. But in that silence, something passed between them. Not approval. Not pity. Just the recognition of a storm that had already begun to move and the choice to remain seated anyway. Together. By morning, the steps of New Eden Church looked the same. Stone, worn at the edges, swept clean like always. The bell still rang at 9, like it had every Sunday for generations. But something had shifted in the sound just slightly. A drag in the rhythm. A pause in the final note. Inside, Reverend Trenton stood in the narthex with his collar pressed stiff and his sermon notes folded twice in his breast pocket. He greeted people with the same smile he always used, just enough teeth, just enough warmth. But fewer hands reached back this time. More nods. Fewer eyes. The sanctuary filled slowly. Familiar faces. Familiar coats hung on the same row of brass hooks. But the pews didn't fill the same way. There were spaces where there hadn't been before. One couple came in, stood in the aisle for a moment, then turned around without a word. Their footsteps echoed all the way out. By the second hymn, the silence between verses stretched a little too long. And then, during the announcements, it happened. A man near the back stood up. Retired Army. Everyone knew him, Mr. Green, from the feed store. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't step forward. Just held a piece of paper in both hands like it might slip if he didn't grip it right. "I have a statement," he said. "Not from me. From the local chapter of the American Legion. And from the board of the VFW." A hush moved across the room like a breath held too long. He read slowly. Carefully. A few sentences at a time. Not naming names. Not pointing fingers. Just facts. That a decorated Marine had been asked to leave a community space. That the woman who stood beside him had been removed from her post. That silence from leadership spoke louder than most words ever could. When he finished, he folded the page back into his coat pocket. No one clapped. No one needed to. Outside, a truck pulled up. It belonged to the woman who ran the quilting circle. She didn't come in. Just sat in the cab, engine running, watching through the stained glass like she was trying to remember what this place used to feel like. Later that day, the church received 3 letters. One from a veterans outreach group in Birmingham. One from a seminary in Atlanta. One unsigned, written in careful cursive, sealed with a pressed flower. Joanna didn't hear about any of it right away. She was at the library, cataloging a new box of donations, most of them paperbacks with cracked spines and faded covers. Luther was there too, fixing a loose leg on one of the reading chairs. Benny lay nearby, his ears twitching each time the hammer struck wood. But in the quiet of that room, something unspoken had found shape. Not revenge. Not a headline. Just the slow return of clarity. And somewhere in a town still learning how to listen, a door that had once been closed was beginning to loosen on its hinges. The folding chairs were set out in a loose circle that afternoon, not because anyone planned a meeting, but because that's how the room felt most honest. The sun came through the front windows in long, slanted streaks, catching dust in the air and warming the arms of the wooden furniture. A tray of store-bought cookies sat untouched on the table near the door. The coffee had gone lukewarm in its pot, but no one moved to pour a new batch. Joanna sat closest to the bookshelf, a small notepad resting on her lap, though she hadn't written anything in it. Camila leaned against the window frame, arms crossed, watching the sidewalk like she was waiting for something. A couple of new faces had wandered in quietly, cautiously, drawn more by the atmosphere than by any flyer or post. People who'd heard, not asked. Luther was the last to sit. He didn't take the center seat or the one by the wall. He chose the chair beside the coat rack, just close enough to hear, just far enough to leave if he needed to. Benny settled beside him with a soft sigh, paws stretched forward, eyes half closed but alert. No one prompted him. No one turned to him with that expectant look people sometimes gave veterans, like their silence was just a pause before something profound. But then, without shifting in his seat, without clearing his throat, Luther began to speak. His voice was low. Not strained. Just quiet. Like the kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention but earns it anyway. I don't usually talk in groups, he said, eyes resting on a spot somewhere near the floor. But I keep hearing things. That she stood up for me. That she took a risk for a man like me. He paused. His thumb moved along the side of Benny's vest, tracing a frayed edge that hadn't been repaired yet. Truth is, I didn't even plan to stay that day. I just wanted a warm place to read. A room where my dog didn't get stared at like he was part of what's wrong with me. Someone shifted in their chair, not to interrupt, just to listen more carefully. But when I walked in, he said, she didn't flinch. She didn't ask why I was there. She just nodded. Poured the coffee. Let me sit. That's all. He looked up, just once. Not at anyone in particular, but at the room itself. At the quiet it held. For a long time, I stopped thinking places like this existed. Where I didn't have to explain myself. Where someone didn't assume they already knew. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking just enough to be human. "So no," he said, voice thinner now. "She didn't stand up for me. She stood with me. And I'll remember that longer than most medals I've got in a drawer." No one clapped. No one said thank you. They just sat there, in the stillness he left behind. And somehow, in that silence, the room felt taller. Like it had shifted to make space for a man who'd spent years shrinking himself just to fit. The door to the library didn't creak that morning. Someone had oiled the hinges. No one mentioned it, but Joanna noticed. She paused as she opened it, just for a second, then stepped inside with a bag of oranges and a stack of new flyers under her arm. The flyers weren't hers. They were from the quilting group across town, looking for volunteers to help sew lap blankets for local VA hospitals. Someone had left them folded neatly on the desk overnight. The coffee was already brewing. Camila stood at the counter, sleeves rolled, eyes soft with sleep but steady. She didn't speak. Just lifted a hand in a quiet good morning and kept stirring. Luther sat in the back corner with Benny curled under his chair, a paperback open in one hand, thumb marking a page he hadn't turned in 10 minutes. His posture hadn't changed much, but the way he sat, less braced, more settled, told its own story. The room filled slowly. Not with noise. Not with rush. But with presence. Mr. Green came again. So did Mrs. Vaughn, who brought a tin of shortbread and set it down with both hands like it might fall apart if handled too quickly. A young man Joanna didn't recognize slipped in near the end of the first hour and took the chair by the heater, head down, baseball cap in his lap. No one asked his name. No one asked what branch. Joanna placed the oranges in a ceramic bowl by the window. She didn't explain why. Just left them there, bright little suns in the soft light, and went back to sorting the shelf by author instead of genre, because Luther once said it helped him find things easier that way. At some point, someone started humming near the doorway. Not a song anyone could name, just a sound carried by habit. It drifted through the room, settled on the shoulders of those nearby, and faded again without needing to be acknowledged. A woman arrived with a dog. Not a service animal. Just old, gray around the muzzle, and quiet. She stood near the door, unsure, until Joanna looked up and nodded toward the corner. "There's space," she said, "nothing more." The woman smiled. Saturday. The dog laid down at her feet and didn't move for the rest of the morning. By noon, the table near the front held 3 handwritten notes pinned to a corkboard, one offering rides to appointments, one listing grocery pickup times, and one is signed only with initials, offering to just sit and listen, no questions asked. Joanna stepped outside as the sun climbed higher. The air was still cool. She closed her eyes for a moment, hand resting on the railing, and let the quiet fold around her. In a town still finding its way back to itself, this was not a celebration. It was not a rally. It was not a speech. It was people showing up, one by one, and leaving the door open behind them. The boy showed up on a Thursday afternoon, just before the rain. He stood outside the library door for a while, backpack slung low, sneakers too clean for the gravel. His jacket was too thin for the weather, and he didn't knock, just waited. Joanna saw him from the desk but didn't wave. She simply opened the door halfway and stepped aside. He didn't say his name. Didn't ask questions. Just walked in with the careful movements of someone raised to be polite in unfamiliar spaces. She pointed to the table near the back, the one by the heater. He nodded once and sat, pulling out a notebook that was mostly blank. Later, he told her he was writing something for school. A paper about service and sacrifice. He didn't look up when he said it, but Joanna noticed the way he gripped the pen too tightly, the way his shoulders hunched as if trying to fold inward. He came back the next day. And again the next week. Others began arriving, too. A woman in scrubs who never stayed more than 15 minutes. She always brought a travel mug and sat on the floor by the window. She never took off her badge. A man with a cane and a quiet voice started dropping off newspaper clippings, stories of veterans who'd been lost, or found, or simply overlooked. He never stayed for coffee. Just left the articles in a neat pile on the corner of the front desk. One morning, a woman knocked gently, as if unsure the door would answer. She carried a folded American flag in a zippered plastic bag. Said her husband used to read here when he was stationed nearby. She didn't ask to come in. Just wanted to leave the flag somewhere it would be seen. Joanna took it with both hands, held it for a moment too long, and placed it in the display case near the back, beside a paperback that still smelled faintly of tobacco. By the end of the month, the library no longer felt like a place people passed through. It became somewhere they returned to. Not for answers. Not for healing. Just to sit. To be. There were no speeches. No banners. No signs that said welcome in bold letters. But people kept coming. Quietly. From farther towns. From older memories. From questions they didn't know how to ask aloud. And in that small room with dusty shelves and chipped mugs, no one asked for permission to belong. They just did. It was a Tuesday when the new plaque arrived. Simple. Brass. Just small enough to fit beneath the window where the afternoon light settled best. Joanna didn't call anyone to install it. She placed it herself, kneeling slowly, cloth in hand, wiping the glass before pressing it gently into the wood. The words were quiet, no flourish, no dedication, no list of donors. Just a line etched in careful serif. Legacy isn't who we remember. It's who we stand for. She didn't linger afterward. She stood, straightened her skirt, and walked back to the front desk where the old bell still rang too sharp whenever someone opened the door too fast. But that day, it didn't ring. The door opened slowly. A boy walked in. Not the same one from before. This one was taller, shoulders squared too deliberately for his age, his jacket too big at the elbows. He looked around, scanning the room, then walked over to the shelf labeled biography and pulled out a title with a name he couldn't pronounce. Joanna watched him from the corner of her eye. She didn't approach. Didn't ask if he needed help. Just made sure the space around him stayed steady, stayed safe. Luther arrived not long after. He didn't sit in his usual chair. He stood near the coffee station for a while, looking at the new stack of white mugs someone had donated, each with a different word painted in blue. Listen. Sit. Stay. Breathe. He chose the one that read sit, filled it halfway, and joined Joanna near the window. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the sidewalk remained uneven. The street lamp across the way still flickered in the early hours. Nothing had been rebuilt. Nothing had been renamed. But the air inside the library moved differently now. It held the weight of something stitched together slowly, one presence, one kindness, one hard decision at a time. Mrs. Vaughn dropped off a tin of lemon bars. Camila posted a new flyer for a book drive. The flag in the display case no longer looked like a memory someone had put away, it looked like a promise someone had kept. Joanna turned a page in the notebook by the register. wrote one word in neat, cursive script. Stay. Then she closed it gently, let her fingers rest there, and breathed out without sound. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can do for a person is not speak for them. It's to stay beside them. Even when the room is quiet. Even when no one else sees. Especially then.